So hello again, everyone. This is our last session of the guest lectures and the Singapore Contemporary Architecture Conversations for this term. We'll be resuming again next term with another exciting lineup of architects from Singapore and also from the region, and hopefully some designers also from related disciplines. I'd like to thank everyone for coming out and everyone who's been with us at other sessions also during the term. It's probably appropriate, I think, that we end the term on the subject of the social, which is a subject that we've been circling around at many moments in our previous sessions also. I feel it's a good place to conclude for now because the social is a subject that's very much on the agenda for architects, and because we keep hearing about the need for architects to engage social issues, either because they'd improve the experience of buildings and of the urban environment, or because there are societies that can benefit a great deal also from the architect's work. Many of our current students at ASD have been learning already and studying already in this context, and thus you would all not know how recent this phenomenon actually is. It was really only after the turn of the millennium, I think, that this re-emphasis on the social has come to our attention in such a strong way. I think in part it's grown due to the new engagements by OMA, other Dutch architects and other design firms around the world with program, and with a kind of attack on form itself as the autonomous center of the discipline. And even more in the age of social media, there are greater expectations that buildings will provide a platform for new experiences and engagements among people who are connected in multiple and different ways. This is the rise of co-working, co-living, of AIRBNB, and of a generation who more than ever prefer to travel, to eat, and to experience rather than to buy goods in shops. We all know that times are changing, and there's a drive to know how the next generation of buildings will adapt and transform to this challenge. At the same time, a sense of global crisis through, for example, environmental disasters or war or other causes has created opportunities for architects to engage themselves in work that has social impact. This would include collaborative efforts for building better quality projects in developing countries or designing prefab shelters for areas that have suffered the destructive forces of war or maybe of weather. This itself is now a debated subject. Many argue that these projects revive colonial ideas of the white man's burden or employ volunteers in unethical ways. Even the prefab shelter sometimes seems to be a cynical way to grab at design awards while striking a moral pose. Many would prefer to see the architect create positive social impacts closer to home. Regardless, however, the bottom line is that the social remains a pretty lively topic for architectural discussion, whether it's a tool for doing good works or creating opportunities for us to enjoy ourselves and each other's company. So tonight, we're very lucky to be joined by two architects whose work excels at the social and who really understand, I think, the way that buildings can contribute positively to our human environment. I'm looking forward to hearing about their new works and to hearing more about the projects that are already recognized for their excellence. Our first contributor tonight is Chee Huang. A little bit about Chee Huang. He joined DP Architects in 2003 and was appointed director in 2014. Before joining DP, he was at architectural practice Foster & Partners in UK for 2 years, where he worked on the design of the new Wembley Stadium and the flagship store of Asprey, the luxury brand. Chee Huang has been an active member of the Singapore Institute of Architects since 2006. He's participated and led various key events, such as the Venice Biennale, and chaired the organizing committee for Singapore's Archifest between 2009 and 2011. A council member since 2010, he currently serves as the first vice president for the Institute. In academia, Chee Huang has served as an adjunct design tutor with the National University of Singapore, Department of Architecture, for the past 8 years since 2006. Chee Huang spent a year of exchange in Bartlett School of Architecture at the University College of London from 1999 to 2000. He completed his Master of Architecture in 2003. Upon graduation, he received top academic honors, including the SIA Medal and Board of Architects Medal and Book Prize. We're also very happy to have with us none other than Nan Chyuan, who's here. Nan Chyuan's bio is actually mainly about his personality and his passions. It says a lot about, I think, the qualities of enjoyment, surprise, and humor that we see in Pharm's work. So I'll read it to you. It goes like this. As a little boy, Nan Chyuan would spend hours cycling around his neighborhood, making sketches of houses he saw. And it was clear then that there was nothing he would rather do than architecture. He finds beauty in geometry and patterns. From furniture pieces to urban planning, he believes that good design should be responsive, intelligent, and sincere. Architecture aside, Nan Chyuan likes to think of himself as a semi-retired footballer. So let's please welcome our guest tonight with a round of applause. Please join me. Thank you.
I prefer Nan Chyuan's bio. Anyway, very good evening to everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank SUTD, hi Erwin, and Josh for kindly inviting myself here to share with you about this topic of design as social media. And Nan Chyuan's a great friend, so let's take it quite informal. I do have quite a number of slides at least to share, so I may go a bit faster. But if there's any question, I think feel free to stop me. We do have a Q&A, right? Yes. So just on the topic, so this was a topic Josh gave to us, design as social media. So he shared a fair bit. Of course, the keyword design is something that probably brings us all together within this room, but maybe more on the subject of social media. I think to simply put the idea, at least personally I read it, is an avenue for social interaction and creating kind of quite unforgettable social experiences. So obviously, as an architect, the very media that we communicate that or at least conjure that is through architecture. And just a bit about the practice I'm with DP Architects, as Josh shared. Very quick numbers. So of course, we are 50 years young this year. Done quite a number of projects. So some simple numbers. We have about 17 offices globally. And we are not only practicing architecture, we also provide 8 other specialist kind of design, which includes engineering, facade, lighting, landscape, ID, and there's also specialist typology of healthcare and infrastructure. So we do have a huge family. It's 1,300. And the other interesting part is we are quite active overseas. All right, so almost 70% of our projects are located outside Singapore. And of course, there's quite a number of projects that we've done in the past 50 years. Within DP, at least in terms of design, this is somewhat what we call our design-first ecosystem. Effectively, we work on driving for kind of what we call a 4D concept of building a community of design drivers, looking at how we collate data, so an array of it, the idea of promoting discourse, and last but not least, also pushing towards digitizing design, all right? And then this is actually, in fact, one of the kind of a design parameter, or what we call APD within the firm, as a kind of pillars of how we measure design. And related to the subject, obviously one of the part about that is there is a kind of an segment that we focus quite a fair bit on the social dimension of design and architecture. We are very blessed in the last, I would say, couple of years. We've won a number of kind of sizable community-related projects, more in the manifestation of integrated hubs. And these are just a map of the various community-related or projects that we have done or we are doing island-wide. And today, I'll just be sharing 3 of them across a spectrum of scale. So, to start off in terms of an integrated hub, and this is really talking about a project in Tampines, some of the data and demographics, which is our Tampines hub. So, in terms of quantum, it is quite a sizable development, close to over 120,000 square meters, within a 5.7 hectares of site, so just recently completed. This was what the hub used to be, or rather the site itself. So it was already an old stadium with car parks. And this was what, I think quite close to just before the TOP of the last phase. And the brief that was given to us was really this idea, and that was in 2011. So how do we create this integrated lifestyle hub that needs to do this whole array of kind of services and provision? So obviously, we asked, okay, what is that? And to start off with, obviously part of the clue we were also seeking was from the site. The other quite, I would say, a huge, or rather big challenge was, this was also a pioneering kind of model of integrated development where they brought 12 government agencies all under one roof, right? So in fact, we have 12 clients every time we go for a meeting, right? And of course, but what is, I would say, other than the challenge was, what was really quite exciting about it is, here it gives rise to the kind of potential to look at really this notion of integration, because you're able to co-locate them. And with co-location, we can start to push concept of co-sharing, and of course, what comes with it is collaboration. And this was a set of questions that were asked about what more can be done, or what can we really do, because there was already a question at that point of time. The lead agency, I forgot to share, amongst the whole group was People's Association. Obviously, PA, in the context of Singapore, has completed and developed many community club centers. And then that was one of the fundamental questions, even at 2011, about why should we even go to CC, all right, acronyms that we call. And then, so thereby, the team was already trying to trace how the whole typology of CC has been evolving over the years. So from the concept of a simple kind of social center, where I think one of the key offerings in the early 60s was color TV, because typically at home you don't get that access. And all the way to how it's developed, integrating various components and facilities. And this is also a kind of equalities of the idea of something that's quite center-based to shift into a kind of realm where the idea of community center is just an aspect of the entire development. Last but not least, it was also the kind of question or critique about the silo nature, typically, of community spaces at that point of time. So this was us just trying to be fun, all right, about how we can describe them as a certain idea of tin can syndrome, that you can change the packaging or wrapping, but the component itself doesn't really change that much, all right? And of course, the way they stratify spaces, the idea is been defined, and at that point of time, and even today, what is the relevance of community space that it's so kind of purpose-built for the residents or the community around it? So with that, one of the key things that started or sparked the idea of our Tampines Hub, I'll call it in short, it's easier, OTH. Sounds like a hospital, but it's not, all right? All right, OTH was really to dig deep and question. And this is to do with the kind of participatory process or participation from the residents that gives rise to the very making of the character of OTH. And that's really extracting some of the key defining characters of the township itself and looking at how could we bring up the best of some of these identities. And obviously we talk about the other unique angle is the participatory design process. And at that point of time, I think it was the first major or mega community project that tried to reach out to all the 250,000 Tampines residents. All right, I'll share a bit in detail. So even the groundbreaking itself was, the numbers got cut off. I don't know whether I can adjust the aspect ratio. So there was like we said, so through a whole series of different avenues, from roadshows, block parties, floor parties, social media channels, and even newsletter, going back to the old school, man, to reach out and so something which is quite unique in terms of process. And this was how the design also evolved through the years, through the entire participatory process. So what was very interesting, some may not be aware, we started with a gross plot ratio of 1.4, but through the different engagement, not only with the residents, but also with agencies and stakeholders, the plot ratio ballooned to 2.8. Yeah. So that was the kind of intensification exercise or land optimization that we were confronting in the idea or design of this community space. Right, so but part of the core principle to start is also understanding the strategic role the space kind of play in relation to essentially kind of residential fabric on one side And then on the other end, the Tampines Commercial Center. So, and with that, the idea is, besides the whole understanding of a development of this nature, is to really try to kind of interpret and decipher it as a series of microenvironments. And this is one of the earlier diagrams that we drew. And this was the array of buildings components. So, and the host of facilities were all listed here. It's quite crazy. So 12 agencies, close to about, I think, over 50 different kind of facilities, all housed. And some of them are quite huge. See, 1,008. So there are 2 sports hall, 1 stadium, 6 pools. That's just the sports side. All right. There's also health component. There's hawker center. So those who have been there, you'll probably have a sense. So quite an array of programs all together. So obviously the whole exciting part about it is how can we kind of bring all these different, we call landscapes of Tampines together, both in terms of the social dimension, the arts and culture, all right, and even the sports, right through to the space. And in terms of strategy to start, was to really start thinking about the way these facilities, the way that it could be designed spatially in terms of clusters rather than floors. And that is, of course, to maximize the notion of interaction across users of different facilities. So say someone in a library could also enjoy the games on the football field, all right, without partaking. But the idea is really to maximize spectatorship, and through that, we believe can encourage participation. And so the entire kind of hub is actually made up of various kind of 3D components, all right, organized in clusters. So this is just the facade itself. So within even this library, this hybrid space of library, art, performance, theater, and some of the community club space, you could see the definition of various volumetric kind of clusters kind of expressed. And the idea is really about that, this idea of chance encounter. This is on the upper kind of foyer space that overlooks some of the sports hall, which is most of the time inherently quite inward looking. All right? So other principles, the whole idea of creating an entire porous ground floor. And one of the interesting things is, like I said, we have 12 owners. So everybody wants an entrance on ground. So the decision is nobody will have an entrance on ground. And then, the agreement or the alignment was, and then we had to sit down and agree what were the core facilities to be located on the ground floor. And I would say that what is quite encouraging in terms of Tampines is, for the ground floor, only about 15% of the area is actually dedicated to commercial spaces. The rest are primarily community or social based in terms of nature of space. Of course, the idea is to design spaces for a large number of residents together, but also be mindful of the idea of intimacy within the space. Notion is also about creating various opportunities to overlay spaces with different programs, and it just starts simply with how you name the space. So if you go to OTH, instead of calling it a football field, it's now called the town square, all right? Because we want the residents, of course, the lines are still painted on the ground, but the idea is, and as some of you may have known, you can carry out a whole array of various kind of events based on that. So from something that which is like FIFA 2-star kind of football field, they use it for yoga, various sports gatherings, I think the kids, or different play fields. And one of the ideas is because all the various dance studios surrounds, or only this side is F&B. These other 2 ends are dance studios. So these are also spill-out areas for the different groups of users when they don't have a major game on. And of course, the other part is the role OTH play in relation to the larger Tampines, and this is really talking about connectivity. And part of the strategy is to understand the various flow patterns of the residents. And one of the key kind of ordering datum within that is, I think, what we call festive walk, which is effectively a thoroughfare that brings the residents from the Central or Tampines Central right through to the Tampines Central Park, all right, towards this part of the residential fabric. So that's the kind of arrival space. This is the streetscape that is brought through. And the idea of streetscape here is also intensified in the various layers into various elevated walkways. So the kind of constant participation through the various movement around the building, right through the green. So when you walk, you can always see different kind of streams of movement of various users. All right. So coming through to the Central Plaza, that's the Tampines Town Center, right through to the Tampines Central Park, right? And then obviously in terms of model, one of the key things that we were challenging and I would say quite encouraging was we managed to convince, say, a key member like even PA that to move away from their typical idea of kind of designing community space as a kind of defined object. So you see CC itself, because there's a danger, and it's still happening now, unfortunately, in some other projects where even you get stakeholders together, they'll say that this is CC, this is my kind of a library, etc. So the whole idea was to, through the notion of integration, encourage them to kind of rethink their kind of participation within this entire development to work more like a network. So we effectively took out, or rather organized various programs based on programmatic synergy, and then we started with the community club and split them or redistributed them throughout the entire compound. So one of the answer, because they say, okay, what if someone asks where is the CC? We say the CC is everywhere, right? So it's a very good way to share an answer. So obviously with that, the various synergy that's created with other programs. This is an example of, say, within the, and given that we also have the opportunity to start to challenge typical definitions of other kind of stakeholders. So within the library component, they are already organized by so-called age group. These are the various community clubs and arts program that's weaved right through its envelope. So because, for example, this is all age group, some of the spaces we share the interaction. And even within the all age group, we have a culinary studio. So for CC frequent user, you know that that's like a program within community club. But we thought what's quite cool and nice is if you can prepare your food and get your recipe just right outdoor. So we brought the program right into the space. So this within that, the library spaces, so obviously volumetrically linked. And then some of the areas. So it's also started with that kind of nature of programmatic strategy to change the concept of library, that they're no longer the kind of silent or shishi space, you know. Shishi, yeah, all right. So obviously there's also areas for more kind of quiet reading. And then the idea is, see, you can be within your own space, but part of a larger crowd. So, and the kids one is quite fun. Speaking as a father with three very active kids. So it's also about creating quite kind of delightful environments for them. And we have also brought the kids' playground, again, a part of another stakeholders component right into the space, because we wanted to conjure this whole concept of fun, or rather the whole idea of learning is fun with the kids. So again, spaces both for wandering, meandering, as well as kind of areas for quite intimate gathering. So also quiet areas for some of us, and a little bit more serious, but at least comfortable. So for the youth, again, even within this library, various kind of notes, some details, and cranks for bigger scale and smaller scale gathering, all right? So even the idea of landscape here, it's again, not just something that you view from an interior space. We brought the trees right into the spaces as organizing kind of element, as well as areas where, you know, shelves are designed around. So within the entire kind of facade, if you unwrap it, these are the kind of series of networks that's integrated within the whole extent of OTH, right through to the spine. And then, of course, the last part is, given the chance of creating an integrated hub, there's also the opportunity of creating an integrated kind of ecological framework. And this is really kind of promoting a closed loop system. Say, for example, the energy that's harnessed from the PV cells are used to light up the basement car park lightings. And then the food waste generated from the hawker center through the eco-digester is converted to fertilizer and brought up to use or reuse at the eco-community gardens. All right, so, and obviously technology is a key part. Various kind of simulations and studies that's also brought in. Hawker center, ventilation kind of a simulation. I think this was meant to show a whole host of various responsive technology. But last but not least, because they are all centered around kind of enabling the participants. So this was part of the roadshow and focus group, the engagements. That was the MASIC. I think this was ITE. This was tours that the team was giving to various residents. The kind of cooking class, I think they had some, what was it, the Master Chef kind of version. So the eco-community gardens, as well as the different participation. And of course, in terms of the social media space, for those who are quite familiar, so there is also a lot of discussion and participation of, or at least discussion about OTH itself, documenting its various kind of development to the various spaces that the community is enjoying, or sometimes feedbacks about what could also be improved. All right? So, and this was really, and part of the whole idea of the development of this nature, and I think maybe more so the whole idea of community space is the actual process of designing, or rather the whole idea of the test of the development starts from when it's completed. All right? So the second project of a totally kind of other end of the spectrum is looking at what we call idea of community or catalyst of smaller components. So this is located within my hometown, Marine Terrace. So I'm a Marine Terrace boy. I grew up there. This kind of HDB block 52. So only 360 square meters. All right. The client is this group known as Montfort Care, all right, that established a whole network of social services facilities, particularly strong in the eastern sector, right? So they already have a whole host of programs. And then, but it was really specifically addressing one of, I would say, a social issue of this stay-alone elderly, which increasingly there were, unfortunately, cases of deaths in home because of the challenge of social isolation that's usually associated with all these stay-alone seniors. And within Marine Terrace, unfortunately, I think there were already about 3 deaths. So the whole idea was how could design be a vehicle to kind of engage this specific segment of the community that suffers from these ills of being helpless or alone. And it was also, the discussion with the client was to also find an alternative mode of, or model of care, where the current model of social service was this idea of providing door-to-door services. So they knock on the doors of the uncle and auntie, say, all right, this is your food or your lunch, or uncle, auntie, this is the pamphlet, read it for your health kind of awareness. But it works against the psyche of all these stay-alone elderlies, because it kind of totally negate the need to even step out of their home, all right? And obviously, in terms of the brief, what was given to us, the wish list, it was still very much a conventional center. You know, the typical senior citizen center that we see on the ground floor. And we were also trying to challenge this fundamental typology of how can we improve spaces of this nature, especially the idea where they are typically gated or glazed up, what we call fish tank, all right? And the whole notion of threshold was something that we were very interested to kind of explore, to investigate if there's other forms of looking at. And within the site, of course, a very generic space, how can we make this a space of certain delight, but still a place that's quite familiar for the residents? So obviously with that, one of the key component, or we will say the catalyst that's brought in, is the whole notion of food. And the power of food, obviously, the whole idea of food consumption, or rather the rituals related with food, is very much already a social act itself. So the idea is through designing or a program related with food, and in this case, kind of enhancing the component of a communal kitchen or community kitchen, the aim was to reframe how these elderlies, all right, who are typically seen as objects of charity, as active participants of our community. So the site itself, earlier we shared, obviously was to also draw some of the kind of identities, and within East Side, food is already a big thing. So located within the kind of very mature estate, I used to stay around here, or rather my parents are still here, right? So this is the site, faces outdoor car park, kind of, it's quite near the wet market, which is a really nice thing. And this block itself is one of the rental flats around the estate, right? So this was the kind of diagram that we started. Obviously, first strategy in terms of zoning, as we shared, kind of shifting the role into kind of stewards of their own spaces. This is some of the idea of, again, the culture of food. So obviously, food ritual involves the whole act of pre-cooking. So you gather, wash the kind of vegetables, prepare the food, the whole act of dining, and then, of course, then what follows is the washing up. But with that, it creates the opportunity for this various interaction with amongst the different seniors. So this was the kind of spaces that were given to us. So you see the kitchen component was actually not too big. So by reframing the kind of heart as the kitchen space itself, so we created a center for this kind of generically autonomous or homogeneous void deck, and studying various kind of configurations. So we went through a whole exercise with some of the social care worker and the uncle aunties that were kind of at least quite open to discussion. So this was quite a difficult group to engage, and so quite different from OTH, where you can have more open dialogues. So this was working with the kind of arrangement that they prefer, and we have to work with the existing structure. So the idea was to create this kind of open kitchen top that allows not just the act of cooking, but also interaction, right? So next key idea, or rather design ideology, was really the part about thresholds. So so moving away from the idea of what we call this kind of gated compound, we design the facade as a series of doors. So again, it is already suggesting that in terms of the community, all are welcome. And with that, we also fulfill this whole idea of creating a highly kind of well-ventilated space right across the entire block. So this was the kind of cross-section. So we wanted to invade into the lawn space by HDB, but that was a bit tough. But we're still trying. All right, so from a space of this nature to that. So this is when the center is closed. So it's designed a series of full-height glass door. So part of the thing is, some of you may ask, why do we need to enclose? All right, so in the event of, say, the haze condition, they still need to keep it enclosed and at least cool the space. But typically, if you visit Good Life, you see that all the doors are open every time during its operational hours. So this notion of openness also blurs the boundary between what is the center versus what is the kind of common space and public realm, and to allow, again, maximizing chance encounter by residents who are walking past. And what is interesting is many residents, when we first designed, was wondering whether this was a new coffee shop. Yeah. And once they found out that they offer food, actually many came and asked to join in terms of the breakfast or lunch. So obviously the third part is this is aligning with the client's kind of vision of aging, that is something that should be celebrated and really vibrant and active. And again, colors here, not just in terms of the aesthetic aspects, because many of the seniors suffer from mild dementia. And the colors are used effectively as quite functional zoning areas, at least through the center for us to plan. And they are also very effective communication kind of elements. So you just have to tell, because the center serves senior residents across the various races, all right? So they just say, blue color, you do this, or red color, you go and, they say, Hokkien, tiak all the tauge, you know, that means you prepare all the bean sprout, right? So it becomes a very easy way, and of course, one of the dimension to depict these colors is through food texture. So we have also designed iconography to allow them to further communicate the use of this space, again, making things a lot more inclusive. So these are some of the visuals. I just visited the place a few days ago. It was quite funny, and it's something quite nice. It's, you can see the homeliness coming. So all the uncle, aunties starting to put some of the artworks, because besides the whole act of cooking, the clients also use it as opportunities to conduct various like art therapy or various kind of talks or workshops for these senior citizens. Right, so simple, but we thought quite fun and delightful. And then this is actually Mr. Loy, and there is this recording by Good Life Makan. If you have chance, take a look. It's on the web. What was very powerful about what he depicted or shared about Good Life Makan was, he said, when they first came and looked for me and said, "Uncle, come, we will give you food." All right? He said, no, thank you. But they went back up again and told Mr. Louis, say, "Uncle, can you come and help us make the food for others?" He said yes. So the whole idea is how we could, through the way we design and conceive space and even communicate the usage or the ownership of space to the users, we can start to kind of spur new changes in terms of this segment of users. So sure, I can come and help. All right. Last one, quickly. So I'll hand over to Nan Chyuan. Is this whole idea of bus stop. So transport obviously is a hot topic now. So this topic actually started quite a while ago. I think 2014. All right. So it was more of a kind of a exercise that DP, my team, has done to look at. All right. So this is just to share the various participants, even for a bus stop or bus shelter. So from infrastructure, of course, with URA, AUDE, LTA, IDA, and NParks, and these are some of the content generator. So at that point of time, what was interesting is near 2012, Hedderwick designed or designed the London bus. So obviously, I was a bit of a sports junkie because of Sports Hub and all the OTH thing, right? So visited it and saw the buses. But it triggered something that was quite I thought deep, was like, hey, what is the Singapore version of kind of our bus, you know? So it's like, okay, then you saw this picture, like, not sure, you know? So is it going to be something as kind of stylistic or formal? But actually, his kind of expression is still deeply rooted to maybe the whole idea of how the London bus was originally designed. So it was really asking, and at that point of time, we were already working on OTH. So we were aware of the power of the notion of something big, but equally interested to look at the power of, or the beauty of smallness, and then from the exercise of good life, right? And then we were also looking at the genre of bus stop typology across Singapore. And in fact, when you research it, there are a lot of very beautifully designed bus stops, but somehow most of them are kind of or reconverting to this type of bus stop. So we're like, oh, what's going on, no? And why were there so much angst? Was that maybe the whole idea is the community don't really own or has anything to say about the bus stop design. So to trigger the exercise, obviously one of the very functional things is still about time. We must find a way through the bus stop to kind of, I don't think the word is to distort, but to make better use of time so that instead of a painful kind of experience of waiting, it can be something that is delightful, again, quite beneficial. And and this was related to one of what we call a project bus stop, and it's actually related to a larger exercise that our team was really looking at, something we call Project Blind Spot. So they somehow just has this acronym of BS, So that was our code word within the team. But the whole idea was that we as users of the city sometimes develop blind spots to things that we see daily. And somewhat you get desensitized. But if we can shift a certain aspects of it, certain new possibilities can start to emerge. All right? So with that, we put out a whole array of kind of different design strategies, and in a very thick-skinned way, we just went and knocked on the doors of agencies and said that, we think the whole idea of Singapore version of bus stop should be converted from bandy bus. So the back carriage is a mobile kind of library or social space. So your whole city is covered with all these various programs, and they're all mobile, we can reach everywhere. So we're looking at deployable one, and then we're looking at converting MRT carriages, and even the whole idea of bus stop. So has someone seen this game that was on AXN, I think Cash Cab or something, where they convert the cab to a kind of game show? So we thought, that's quite cool. If you can hop on the cab and then you share a story. So this was near our SG50, I think 201415, that if you share a story about Singapore, you can get a free ride. So this was all the things that we threw. And of course, what came out, I think, was the bus stop project. But I think in terms of data, what was also interesting is the numbers of commuters. So daily, we talk about close to, this is the latest number, 3.9 million of users. And then island-wide, there's more than 4,600 stops. So this is our entire site, we thought. All right? So, but of course, to start the prototype, we were given a site kindly by URA, together LTA, to look at a bus stop located within Jurong Central. So this was a bus stop that was given, BS02, all right, still called BS, all right? Okay, 25 meters. So it's a kind of quite long version of bus stops because it's spread across, and this was what it used to look like. But it was a heavily utilized stop because it's the first stop from the interchange itself, all right, that most people hop on. So the exercise started, a whole series of program. How can we start to rethink bus stop as an extension of our kind of public realm and social space? So the strategy was really to conceive a whole kit of parts based on modular components as plug-in. And this was quite interesting because at the point of time when URA gave us a site, for a while we were a little bit kind of taken back. We'll say that, oh no, what we fall for the pitfall that actually Jurong bus stop should look like this, but we should not be the one who's kind of defining it. So the whole exercise was more of a demonstration of the possibilities of a bus stop that could be bespoke based on needs of the site. So this was some of the exploration of components from the kind of the smart devices to environmental related one, information-based and the kind of more universal components. And this was the kind of potential of, say, how you could use the palette. Say, if the bus stop is near to the park space, a lot more of the green component versus something that is more, say, informative-based. This was how the design turned out. Cross. So you could see kind of green roof and trees propping up. So this was a various zone, a reflected ceiling plan of the various kind of possibilities. So this was more of a showcase of the possibilities of what bus stop could be like, right? So there were PV cells originally here, and then IDA decided to add one more group to experiment the concept of green Fi, so solar powered Wi-Fi. So the shelter itself was also a kind of canvas, and this is working with one of our local artists who happened to be our colleague and an old Jurong boy about the various landscape of Jurong. So across the site, they named Sayang Jurong. So shelters. So there were physical book sharing. So the different components, the green, but phone charging, as well as a kind of interactive board. So within that, you could plan your journey, and you could also download e-books or e-galleries. So they become key touch point for your further journeys on the buses. All right, so this will zoom in. All right, we talk about the environmental component. So also accessible zones, different kinds of armrests, bike parks. And then I think the encouraging thing was it started a lot of discussion on the various media, especially, and again, it was quite funny because we didn't actually do a recording. So we went to the website and tried to find on YouTube's, and we were quite surprised there were several clips about people filming the bus stop. So, and there were inquiries from all the way, even from States and France, about sharing the whole design journeys of these bus stops. So with that, this is really my sharing in terms of today's subject of how design in the form of architecture could be a powerful element in terms of engineering this whole idea of social interaction. All right, thank you.
Evening. I don't have so many slides, so I will try to talk. Sorry. Okay, thanks. Hi. To be honest, I wasn't really sure about the topic, so I put together some slides, and if it doesn't really make sense, just let me know. I'll just speak a bit faster. So it's I'll share a collection of ongoing projects. So what you see, some of them are not complete, and also some completed projects. So essentially, for those who don't know us, this is kind of the work that we do within the office itself. We have a collection of architects, interior designers, graphic designers, and product designers. So it's not what we kind of planned or how we started. It's just the way, the kind of skill sets that we needed in the office. So we started actually designing exhibitions. And so the idea of curating an experience, using the space and the content to tell the story. And so that was part of the kind of DNA, the kind of the work that we did. And so, and these are our recent exhibitions that we've completed, and we are still working very closely with the museums. So you can see the team that's kind of responsible for this exhibition. There are 2 graphic designers, 1 architect, a filmmaker, and an interior designer. So they all have different kind of separate skill sets. Some talk to the client, some manage the contractors, some manage the graphics, some plan the space, and so on and so forth. So that is how the team is organized, and that is how we work. And so we take the same kind of extension into space. So this is a recently kind of completed project, still trying to TOP. So we should open in January. So hotels, we found that they are the kind of natural step forward in terms of curating experience, telling stories within the space. So architecture, interior, branding comes in a single kind of environment. So the wallpaper that you see, which is the laser, the green. So this is actually an illustration by an in-house graphic designer. These are actually the clients. So we kind of do insert elements like this within the space itself. So then I'll kind of step back a bit to kind of talk a bit about how we do things and the way that we work. So for this project, it's also another hotel. We actually started kind of designing a website first as an interface for us to engage the client and to discuss the work. Actually, he engaged us to do the website first. So from the website, we started to talk about the space, we started to talk about other possibilities. The idea of using the website, if you think about hotels, the first interaction with the brand actually starts with the website. So you interact with the website, and when you visit the hotel, you hope that the experience continues. So we were using the website and the interface itself to kind of allow customers to select exactly what they need in a space. And so the hotel room that you arrive in will only have the things that you need, and so you don't pay for what you don't need. What we found interesting was that the virtual possibilities is actually more than the physical room type. So for example, we have 30 rooms, but based on the selection, the user would imagine that the hotel is actually quite big and quite varied. And so once you arrive in a space, this is a hotel with 34 rooms, we will then design each of the moments that we promised that the room would have. And therefore, the rooms is accumulation of the moments or the desires and nothing else. And then that becomes part of the experience. So we are now taking the same approach to designing spaces from a room to a stack, and from a stack into a building. So we are applying this. This is not the scheme that he chose, but we're doing another one in KL for this client. So that kind of conversations of starting from kind of very intimate experience point of view and then expanding that into architecture. So I'll touch on another range of work that we do in the office. So AIRBNB is one of our first clients for office design. So this is the first time that we interacted with kind of a global brand that comes with a very clear direction of who they want to be and what they want the space to be. So they have a very clear kind of spatial guide and brand guide that has very upfront deliverables in terms of the vision of the space, but also very clear physical kind of experience which they wanted. So the gaps in between is where they allow the local designers to then interpret the brief. So this was one of a first experience that we had, kind of understanding other people's experience, brand guidelines and design guidelines, and interpreting that into space. So we are now working with Ascot to develop their new service apartment brand targeting millennials. So we started a process of kind of a user experience. So there was a 3-month workshop with the clients to identify key touch points, and then we will then develop both the spatial and the brand guide as an outcome. So there was a kind of a ideation process with the client, and then we went through spatial outcomes, testing of site test fits, experience check-in. Looks a bit like the Marine Parade kitchen, but no. So this is the kind of a idea of a social kitchen. The main thing is to take out what is in a typical service apartment and bring the kitchen down into the ground floor. So instead of buying 600 kind of low-range microwave, they'll buy 10 really good ones downstairs. And same for the TVs and so on and so. So the room has no TV, 14 meters square, kind of a very basic space. And so we went into brand extension possibilities and also products and other attributes. So this is building up the brand guide in terms of spatial and brand guide. So now I understand they are extending to other countries, and architects are taking on our guide and they are starting the work. Right, so this is an ongoing project. It doesn't have a name yet, but it's interesting because as part of the design, we were asked to consult the end user, which is the current office crowd. So they have about, if I'm not wrong, 400 to 800 staff in different locations. And we had to conduct a very quick user kind of workshop focus group in less than 5 weeks. So we work with a local creative company, kind of user design called Stark. I'm not sure whether there are anyone here. Okay, so they came up with this idea of the workplace Tinder. I don't use Tinder, so I assume apparently you swipe left if you like something, and you right or left. So either way. So so the idea was that it's actually fully digital. We can send this app to all their staff, and based on the image, they will select left or right, whether they like or don't like. So this information, so there's 23 images that were selected by us and the client, and that will be sent to this app, and the 400 over respondents can then do a selection of yes or no. And so they're based on different sites, and you can then compare the information very quickly. So we had many rounds of interaction with them. We have the favorite picture, the ranking, the things that everybody don't like, or big contradictions between what the HQ like and what the staff, they are in the satellite offices, actually don't like. So everything is live and ported back into a main database that we will then access and break down and present. So in 6 weeks, we actually went through 3 rounds of interaction. And the good thing is that actually in the design process, you actually can use this system again to get feedback from the users. As of all kind of focus group, you sometimes wonder whether some of this information is premeditated. So the answer is probably yes. We are still trying to fine-tune how do you actually fully engage, and what are some of the key outcomes, and what kind of you can use the information for. So this is another form of kind of public consultation, more old school. And this was actually just last weekend. It's with APAC. So it's pictures, and people will put sticker, and they will tell you whether they like or they don't like. And so this is maybe more analog, and they did it over 9 days. I think it's still ongoing now. So it's in a way interesting for us because, as mentioned, if we start off with kind of an exhibition design with a story to tell, this is one of the site that has kind of interesting story. It's the one and only, if not the first, the only kind of hot spring in mainland Singapore. The second one is actually in Pulau Tekong. So the current counter that you go there is that the hot spring comes out from a tap, which I find it kind of anticlimactic in a sense for Singaporean kids who think that fishes come in the supermarket rack. We felt that it's kind of quite important to, if possible, to bring back as much of the interaction with the water and the ground and the rain, some of these ideas. So NParks was kind of got more and more into it, and they wanted to put in plants and landscaping ideas, which is quite interesting in the way they interpreted the project. And so there's a series of kind of experiences leading up to the bridge, which is a key kind of a space. So these are the toilets and the cafe. So the bridge was an existing bridge left over from MINDEF. It was a constraint that we couldn't move it, but we used that as a main gateway that all the amenities will stop at the bridge. And once you cross the bridge, you will enter into the realm of the ground, the spaces. And the idea of the existing kind of water taps will be then left within the forest, and they have to move through the part of the path to encounter some of these spaces at the back. So we created a series of cascading kind of water pools on the pretext that we want to cool down the water to 40 degrees. The source is about 60, 70, bring it down to 40 to let people dip their feet. And then there are other encounters of shelters and interactive elements, egg cooking stations, and so on and so forth. We are having a problem now that we can't really cool down the water as much as we try. And we have done many rounds of testing. So we've kind of theoretically understood that there must be a relationship between volume, surface area, and we use different formulas. Our M&E couldn't kind of really, he decided not to be part of this exercise. So if anyone here understands cooling and energy, please let me know. We need some help. The tender for this project is end of the month. I believe that it can be done. It's just that nobody dares to verify our information. So this is another competition that we did with a whole team of very energetic young architects and designers. So this is for Railway Corridor, I think it's 2013 or 14. And we knew that there was no chance, because if you read the brief, it was very clearly written for big firms with big international track record. But we felt that we're just going to give it a go anyway. So we organized a team of, if I'm not wrong, 5 to 6 designers from Singapore and Malaysia because it connects to Malaysia. So we wanted it to then come together as a response, a community response to how we should understand the space. And so there were many rounds of discussion, and the final kind of narrative was, again, it was quite close to SG15 at that time, SG50 at that time. So we wanted to kind of project forward the next 50 years, what kind of space, what would be considered a successful kind of outcome for the rail corridor. So the vision was that it would be fully overgrown and it become a spine where people can go in and discover things and ideas. So we started with the kind of main ideas of scarcity against all odds, the kind of trajectory and thinking of citizens, the growth of the nation, gratitude, ownership, pride, and this big question of love. How do you get the citizens to love the landscape up to the point where they'll take care of it, and they will maintain it, and they will use it? So this is just kind of an example of some of the other work that we're doing. So this board is obviously work in progress. I couldn't find an actual submission board. So there were ideas that we were throwing around and what each architect was supposed to do, and architects was then supposed to take different tranches and be kind of a team leader for a stretch, and then we allow governments and advocates and also TOL of land next to the thing as part of taking short-term ownership to show kind of your care for the space. This is another project, again, is going back 2013, but we felt maybe it's interesting just to share that in a way, we are getting more and more briefs from clients that don't really have a specific traditional architecture brief. So they come to us with a question or with an opportunity. And I think the architecture question is whether is architecture always the solution, or there are other ways to approach the space. So he was a second generation businessman with a big family, the client. His problem to us is that his third generation kids doesn't want to enter the business. So he's into cars, second-hand cars and car rental business. And so he said, I have this building which is in Lorong Ampas. What can you do to it? I want to get my nieces and nephew into the business. So we sat down, we went through many rounds of discussion in the building itself. We found out that it actually had an old canteen license that was never used. So we said, okay, maybe with that you can start some sort of a small F&B as a start. And then we still had this 5,000 square feet at the back that we didn't know what to use, because canteen, there's only allowable a certain percentage. So one of the brothers came back from Taiwan, he said bicycle is interesting, and so on and so on. So that started the conversation, and that led to this whole kind of Wheeler's Yard, which is both a bicycle and cafe. And incidentally, where this picture is taken is actually a new kind of NParks park connector that just opened up behind the canal. So it's quite kind of nice that the building actually opens up to a park connector, and actually we saw cyclists going back and forth. So that was kind of interesting. I think there's another aspect of the project was that they were operating on canteen license and kind of this bicycle repair shop in a warehouse for the longest time. And obviously, in kind of official terms, they couldn't really get full approval, and they had to operate with certain amount of kind of under the radar. And what we heard happened was that one of the residents who stayed in the area met the owner and then understood what was happening, went to URA to kind of speak separately for other projects. And the URA chief actually came down on a regular Sunday, cycled to the site, went in, nobody knew who he was, sat down, had a coffee, and went back on Monday and said, why not? This is a kind of a good thing, right? So then we started to get a lot of emails asking us to send plans, and they got the approval eventually. So it's quite an unusual process. So they are now going into their second site, which is at Seletar. This one I'll just touch on very quickly. It's an ongoing project. So again, this is not a kind of a pure architecture project, but we kind of got roped in to do ideation, positioning for the building itself. It's a new building, but with an existing architecture team. So it's in One North, meant for new shared media spaces, and the idea of content. So we adopted the story of Alice in Wonderland as a possible kind of idea of creativity, imagination, and exploration. So down into wayfinding, this is applying the signage on the building. We are also doing the ID for the space, so across the different spaces. For this project, we are going one step further into kind of designing the app interface. So Alice now becomes an additional kind of manifestation into the entity that you book events with, meeting rooms, and they will remind you of events and so on and so forth. So on top of that, there's also this art curation layer that is part of the JTC's brief. So actually, we were brought in by the client to do this part of the work. So again, the conversation started and we wanted to expand. So we've been doing kind of curation of different kinds, again, with the exhibition background. For this project, we wanted to try kind of something interesting, that we would make some producers and makers together with content creators, which are not traditional artists, and then to create kind of a new art for the space specific for Alice. So the Alice in Wonderland book will be the brief. So the makers will be your kind of carpenters, your metalwork sculpture, your lighting company, and sound producers. And then the artists would then be bloggers, kind of content people with a lot of high social media following, singers, so on and so forth. So then we're kind of starting the first round into planting the artwork on site, based on site-specific kind of location, to then recommend the artist with the maker to create the new artwork. So all these are kind of ongoing, so it may and may not turn out like this. And so I will end with this is not our project, it's just an observation. I think maybe kind of interesting that Chee Huang started with Tampines. And so the understanding or conversation about architecture and our role in kind of shaping our environment. So over the weekend, the new Admiralty Park just opened a couple of weeks ago. So those who've been there, it's crowded, packed with people. But what we found interesting was that Republic Poly, which is just next to it, started to open up its grounds. And you can go in, you can use the canteen and the shop. So in a way, the school became part of the civic space. And I always felt that schools is always a pity that they will kind of close over the weekends. And in this case, it's an interesting kind of encounter where potentially they could be an important or play a bigger role in terms of our environment or within the community itself. So I will end there. Yeah, thank you.
You guys want to come and sit, and then we can just. Well, thanks to both of you. That's really inspiring presentation. A lot of material, which is very on the topic. So this one was really, really well fit to the questions that we wanted to engage. I think since there was a lot of material, I'm sure people have questions. Maybe instead of waiting, we'll just kind of open up to questions immediately from the audience. So does anyone have a question that they would like to ask our guests? We have 2 microphones set up, by the way, for you. Yes, very, very clear subject. No, we have a question. No, not planted in.
Hi, this is a very personal question actually. Because I live near Tampines itself, so I was a frequent goer to a Tampines library. So after the Tampines hub came about, like you guys revamped the whole library and like everything became very sleek and all that. But I felt that like you sort of lose this homeliness to the space. And like previously at the Tampines library itself, there were always a lot of people. There was a large room like for people to study and all that. So people actually linger around in the space. But like when I go to a Tampines hub nowadays, like although you position it in such a way that it actually like there's a lot of people circulating through the space and all that, but actually people don't linger at the library itself. So I think like there's this sense of homeliness which you mentioned in the Makan space as well. Like you're trying to create that kind of homeliness, but I felt that was missing at the Tampines hub. Yeah, so do you think that like this homeliness could be fostered through like this kind of community space? Yeah. All
right, so I was worried that there was a Tampines residence around here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So this looks like one of those residence engagement sessions. No, quite used to it.
Yeah.
No, but it's good to get the feedback. So obviously, one of the, I would say, challenge with new buildings is how do you bring back an old feeling with a new building? And I think many a times that's almost impossible. All right, not to say that, but part of the intention is, you see, the whole concept. I think your critique was mainly on the library space, right? Yeah, okay. But we will, maybe later I'll find out which aspects is not, but which aspects is the one that you felt a little bit less homely. And then because the intention as we shared within the library space is this is actually quite a huge library. It's a regional library. So it's 12,000 square meters of GFA area. So it's I think the second largest. So part of the idea is in fact to work towards breaking down the entire kind of the institution of a library into various, as I shared a bit, those micro environments. So the strategy was spatially to organize them as volumes based on age groups. Because, and then with that, we can create more bespoke environment. So maybe you should try the adult reading section. Maybe feel a bit more. No, because part of the idea of the youth part was we wanted, and it was quite interesting when we were conceiving the design together with the library stakeholders, NLB, that as a social program, library was also facing the challenge of its relevance to the community. And part of the idea was to look at opportunity through design to create a whole array of various, at least in terms of youth, more exciting or fun social setting. But say that if you think that that's not your so-called cup of tea, that's other environments that you can move into. And yeah, at least that's what was the intent.
I think that kind of raises an interesting question, or kind of a follow-up question that has to do with time, because we're always forced to kind of, and I think Singapore is very strong in this, to everything is kind of fresh out of the box, instant, ready to go. We even plant trees that have matured somewhere else and then brought them to the site so that they don't have to grow from, little saplings, right? So I'm always interested in this question of time, because I remember, for example, when the National Library building opened, there was a very mixed response. A lot of people found it very uncomfortable. The size, they found it really alienating. People didn't like the ground floor space. But over time, as you watch this kind of adaptation to it, you start to see a lot that happens in terms of finding like community focus, so like groups that meet there to play like role playing. There's like a group of Dungeons and Dragons nerds that like they have their areas staked out. So the subcultures kind of develop because social life in a way takes time. So I guess that's one of the challenges, is planning ahead for something that's going to happen sort of organically, and then asking your community and your stakeholders to kind of have faith in you that at a certain point it will kind of incubate.
Yeah. So Josh helped me to answer quite aptly. So have a bit of faith. Let's see how it takes place. But if I can just add to that, it's interesting you mentioned that, because it is actually highly relevant in terms of design, or in this case architecture with strong social content, because the very critique was also given to our public housing. When HDB first started, they said it was brutal, it was cold, it's emotionless. But you look at the kind of most authentic and kind of flavored kind of housing estate now are precisely those old HDB blocks, because they have the very character of time and history and use. And I would think that is always one of the key challenge when we create something new or very new. How do you retain, like I said, that kind of old feeling without falling into the kind of the pitfalls of replicas or theme parky kind of idea?
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. I really enjoyed seeing the landscapes. I wasn't aware you guys were doing so much landscape, and it's really nice to see these really kind of, I don't know if you are doing a lot, but I mean, there are these, I think between, the Gambas Park and the railway corridor competition, which I like a lot. I'd never seen that entry. It's a beautiful entry. And I think what's interesting is that, as you're saying, is architecture always the answer? And landscape is very interesting in a way because, as you know, like you never want to photograph it the day it opens, right? Everything is kind of looking awful and kind of, you want to come back a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later. So there's that sense of development, which in a way is probably quite a lot like social development, and it requires a very different way of thinking as a designer.
I think maybe back to that question of, or the answer of time, the notion of newness is also something that we need to kind of understand. Just kind of make sure. Okay, I remember back in school when I think at that time there was certain modules on kind of tropical architecture, and I think maybe my batch and people around our generation, I think I still have memories of my grandmother's atap house, right? So I understand certain notions of overhangs and so on and so forth. But then, if you talk to students, maybe a few years after us, they grew up in HDB, and tropicality to them is a kind of something that it's exists only in hotels and Bali and so on and so forth. So when you talk about certain memories of homeliness, the context is important to understand because the newness and the oldness is actually very different for very wide range of people, right? So my understanding of landscape is very different from someone's understanding because we potentially grew up in a very different physical environment in Singapore that is, because it's changing so fast. I think if you go to places like UK where it doesn't really change that much, the understanding of streetscape, it's quite universal in terms of scale and proportions. But whereas in Singapore, within 10 years, a lot of the environment that we grew up in no longer exists. Right? So the things that we talk about, even at that time when the tutors were telling me, tropical architecture is this and everything, I was kind of trying very hard to remember what it was like because I was already kind of losing touch. So I can imagine that the future generation that grew up in boxes, they have no idea what we are talking about. Right? So the issue of time, I think it works both ways. As much as we need architecture, I mean, we need to grow into the architecture, we need to also understand where we came from. It's a very different kind of a background, and this, I think people in this room will have very different understanding of ground, home, landscape, homeliness, and so on and so forth. Right? So, and when you design for public buildings, you are designing for a very wide spectrum of users. So that this kind of comments would come for sure, and I think it's something that we have to understand.
Is there another question for either of our, or both?
Any other Tampines residents?
Yeah. Not a Tampines resident, I don't think.
Quite close up, Pastor Reese. But anyway, this question is for both guests. Like, I felt like the DP projects that were shared, like, they were very programmatically driven. Like, the programs were designed, as in the design was due to the programs. While for the farm projects, they were more, I found it interesting that there was more designing of the moments, like you mentioned, and user experience was driving the design. So I wanted to ask if these design philosophies were due to the individual firms, or if not, which one would you prefer personally and why?
It's an interesting observation. So obviously I enjoy all the things that Nan Chyuan shared, and I think to that extent there was quite a lot of very experiential dimension in the work that they do. Not to say that's not what we were interested or focusing on, but I would say again back to how Nan Chyuan shared, or rather answered earlier, is the context sometimes that we're dealing with. And to start off, the whole idea of OTH, our Tampines Hub, right? The first issue is really this aspects of scale. So, and when we deal with architecture of a certain scale, the approach will be quite different. Because how do you describe an experience of, say, a building of that nature that's meant to serve? You see, Tampines, the footfall currently 1 million visitors every month. How do you describe a building that is serving 1 million people? So I would say then architecturally, when it comes to that scale, it's interesting, and maybe like what Nan Chyuan said, our generation of architects, That's where, you know, the RAM idea of looking at the opportunity of architecture through the lens of programs comes in. And that is where I think, at least in terms of OTH, we use the very nature of the program or to generate the questions, to allow us to, in that sense, rethink or shift the way we perceive certain programs. And then through that, the possibilities will emerge. And but not to say that experience is not important. It's just from, at least from where we approach, that was the key thing. And obviously, when it comes to the kind of bolts and nuts, that's still quite key. It's just maybe not the emphasis of the sharing today. But in Good Life, surprisingly, though small, the nature of the user was also requires us to start from the very use or the very kind of approach of looking at program. Because at that point of time, the program here was, or rather the client gave us a brief that they wanted a senior center. And then they said, okay, can we do something to do with food? So which is why that's the very thing that we started the whole kind of discussion about how design or architecture in that sense can play a part to capitalize on the ritual of food to generate the kind of spaces or experience. So I would say that it's actually still experience driven, but here we wanted to bring in the aspects of culinary experience plus new social kind of experiences for this segment of users.
Actually, I was going to say the same thing about the issue of scale. So once your project reaches a certain size, I don't know, I've never done a building that size. I think all my projects can fit into one corner of your Tampines farm. So I think once you get to a certain size, you cannot run away with programmatic issues. They become kind of a key organizing kind of elements within the space. And on the question of whether the idea of user-centric design is not new to the realm of design. If you talk to product designers, actually that's how they start. They start from research, they start from the interface, and then they build up the design from there. So it's not new. But for us, we were working in different kind of mini scales. So sometimes we start small, sometimes we do kind of a traditional architecture kind of project. And one thing I realized while working even within the office with different people is that the architects tend to design from, if I may use contractual terms, the big issues first, then they will push the smaller things further and further down. Like, I resolve this first, this thing, I'll talk about it later, and so on. So that is maybe how they are trained to engage problems. You start with a site, even in school, the big site, and then you start to go further and further into the project. But if you talk to product designers, graphic designers, they cannot start if there is no clear idea. So there's always kind of big arguments, even sometimes myself, with the staff, is that I don't understand why they cannot start work yet. But to them, they need to understand this so that they can start to do the small thing first. But you realize that in projects like hotel, it makes sense. The final touch points are actually everything that's done by the graphic designers and the product designers. And the architects near the end are really just rushing for the TOP, right? Contracts and documents. So you do need to be able to have a different kind of mindset to see that there is a value in working across different skills and accepting that design will evolve in different directions, and hopefully they kind of meet in the middle, and we hope all the time that they do meet. But I think that's the main. So I don't think we kind of started off that way. It's just the way of people in the firm working with different styles. Yeah.
And it's interesting how, you know, just as we have to think about the standpoints, the desires of the user, the end user, understanding the client as a social animal also seems to be like a really important thing. Like the kind of ways that a brief is formulated for OTH, right? It's the kind of questions they ask are very different from somebody who comes and says, hey, I've got this, you know, family business, I'm worried about succession, my kids aren't into it, you know. And the way they frame a question is very, very different. One being much more contractual and one being kind of much more exploratory. But it's, you know, one of the things I think to keep in mind is that getting 12 stakeholders from Singapore government to move out of their standard operating procedure and co-locate facilities away from a core and not have entries on the ground floor and mix their programs is really subversive. And I think it takes a lot of kind of very, very careful understanding of what their needs are so that you can satisfy what they want and give them the kind of security that you can deliver a project while taking a lot of risks with their established formats. And I think that what's common in that thread is that just as you have to think about, providing, say, pleasure for a hotel guest, or thinking about their need and what do they want and what do they not want, what do they not want to pay for, there's a kind of I'd say it's almost like an anthropological thing. Like you guys have to really get into the mind of the person you're serving and understand how to communicate with them in the first place. Do we have maybe one last question? You showed an image of like a Hainanese pork chop that made me super hungry. I don't know if that happened to anybody else. Everyone's like ready to eat dinner now.
It's always not the best thing to show.
I know, not at 7:30. Is it maybe one last question, or perhaps we can? Okay. So I'd like to, please join me in saying a very warm thank you to our guests for sharing such an amazing materials with us. And we will see you next term.